Hello, my name's Jim Quinn, and I'm going to be speaking with you for 3 episodes that are focused on a couple of bird species that I have been studying for quite some time. These 2 species are shown in this title slide, and on the left you will see the pook gecko. This is a bird from New Zealand, Porphyrio melanotus, and this is a bird that is a very intriguing cooperative breeder, much like the other bird I'll talk to you about, the smooth-billed ani on your right, Crotophaga ani. This is a bird from Puerto Rico, that's where I study them, and they're also found in the neotropics, so they would be found in Central and South America, as well as in Puerto Rico. When I was 7, I wanted to be Charles Darwin. I wished I could do the job that he did, traveling around the world, studying animals and plants, and trying to understand where they came from. That job obviously was already taken, and so I pursued a route to become a biologist, a scientist, and ended up as a professor of biology here at McMaster University. So I did get to do what I wanted, and I'm quite happy about that. Charles Darwin came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. And in this proposition, he suggested that there were 4 necessary elements for natural selection to lead to evolution. The first one was that there needed to be reproduction going on. And beyond just reproduction, there was a necessity of heritability. In other words, certain characteristics or traits must be able to be passed on by reproduction from one generation to the next generation. This would be required for evolution by natural selection. Thirdly, those traits that were heritable traits needed to have some variation. And so there needed to be variability within the population. For instance, people in populations vary in terms of their height, and they vary in terms of their eye color, and these are traits that are variable within populations. And then finally, there needed to be a variation of fitness related to these traits. Now this last one I think can be illustrated well with the following example. So here we see giraffes. Now these giraffes have different length necks. That means that there's variation of the traits. This variation is heritable. It's passed from one generation to the next by reproduction. And the variation of fitness that we're talking about relates to the fact that the giraffe that has a check mark by its neck is able to reach the leaves better than the other individuals that have shorter necks, and therefore it will survive better and presumably will find a mate and reproduce better. And as a result of all of this, the long-necked genotype, that is the individuals that have a hereditary pattern of having a long neck or a trait of a long neck, will survive and reproduce better than the other 2 examples. Most of us know that genes can affect physical appearance, and usually we know that family members look a bit alike. Here you see a picture of my wife Diane on the right and my daughter Keisha on the left, and I think if you look closely, you will find certain resemblances between the 2 of them, and these are because they are genetically related to each other and share certain genetically based traits. Some of those traits in Keisha are shared with me because I'm her father, and she gets half of her DNA from her mother and half of her DNA from her father.
Cool.
What sorts of traits would allow one to survive better? So one way to survive better is to avoid being predated. And here we see a cartoon where there's a monster that's come to the door, and the caption reads, "When the monster came, Lola, like the peppered moth and the Arctic hare, remained motionless and undetected. Harold, of course, was immediately devoured." So Lola matches her background very well. Harold doesn't. Match your background. It's one way to survive better. So here are peppered moths. They come in 2 color patterns. These are genetically based. A single gene controls whether they're light morph or dark morph. The dark morph is the one on the right. The light morph is the one on the left. Here we see peppered moths in nature. On the left, you see peppered moths in an unpolluted environment. There's a light moth and a dark moth. To the right, you see the same morphs, well, different individuals, but the light morph and the dark morph peppered moth on a tree in the polluted environment. Which color pattern do you think survives better in unpolluted environments? And which color pattern do you think survives better in polluted environments? Assuming you said that in the unpolluted environment, the light phase survives better, you would be right. And in those unpolluted environments, you would find many more of the light-colored morph.
You don't
In
say.
contrast, in the polluted environment, because the light morph is easily detected by the birds which prey upon these moths, the dark morph would survive better, and you find many more dark morphed individuals in polluted environments.
Interesting.
And that reflects natural selection. The visibility of the peppered moth to its predators is what dictates the numbers of dark moths versus light moths in the two different environments. This is a similar case. This flower is called a gaillardia, and interestingly, there's a moth on this gaillardia flower. It's called a gaillardia moth. And this gaillardia moth not only matches the flower well, but it has the behavioral pattern, and this is genetically based, to perch on the flower in an orientation that allows it to blend in with the flower so that birds won't detect it.
Cool.
Here we see a type of insect that disguises itself kind of as a twig. It's called a stick insect, and you can see it here. I'm pointing to it. It's a little more obvious when you know it's there, but it disguises itself as a stick. This branch looks like a thorny rose bush or something like that. It turns out that all of those little thorns that you see there are actually leaf hoppers, and they tend to behave in an appropriate way to make it look like this is simply a thorny plant. Therefore, the predators that would normally take insects like these leaf hoppers would not detect it. Here's a challenge for you. Find the frog. There's a frog in this picture. It's a frog that was in the Amazon rainforest, and it's sitting right now on the rainforest floor. And if you are having a hard time finding it, then I will help you out. There's what it looks like. You can see it in Diane's hand. You met Diane earlier when you met Keisha, my daughter, as well. Many other species engage in cooperative breeding. Starting in the upper right of these images are a familiar species. These are honeybees. This is where we get our honey. These are very important animals for pollinating our food crops. And honeybees are eusocial species. They have specific roles in life. There are worker bees and there are queen bees, and the queens do all of the reproduction, or most of it. And there are male bees known as drones, so they have different roles. Below the bees are acorn woodpeckers. These are birds that have cooperative breeding, that is, other individuals other than mom and dad help raise the young. Lower left are meerkats, so a type of mammal that engages in such behaviors. Above them are the burying beetles. Burying beetles are also cooperative breeders. In the middle frame, we see a type of cichlid, a type of fish that lives in Africa, in the Great Rift Valleys there. And these fish are cooperative breeders. The mother and father are aided by a number of helpers that help raise the young. The upper left is the only mammal that I know of that is very similar in terms of having specific roles, specific castes. They're similar to honeybees. This is the naked mole rat. And there are females known as queens, and the queens do all of the reproduction. They produce all of the offspring. And then there are smaller females that are worker females, and they do not produce babies. They simply help the mother to raise young. And then the final one, the top center, is an image of the Florida scrub jay. Here's the Florida scrub jay. You see two birds that are sitting on a nest. You see offspring in that nest. And these two birds that are sitting on the nest might be the mother. Maybe she's the one that's right down there incubating. And then right next to her on the nest, trying to help out, is a helper. This is a bird that is not the father or the mother of these young, but is helping to raise the young. And then standing just above is the father. Now these birds have been studied for a very long time, since 1975, and they were the first clear example that was presented to the world of a helper at the nest system. And here you see how these birds can help. So you see a helper male, perhaps, that's feeding the young. Another male has brought another food item to the nest, and he's another helper. Meanwhile, it might be that the mother is there. She's doing the incubating, and she's right behind the offspring. And then it may be dad that's down there trying to protect the nest from a snake. And another female in the picture, her head is up. She's giving an alarm call. So only 2 of these birds are thought to be the parents of the offspring in the nest. This is a picture of what happened to a helper when a bobcat visited a nest. So it's a dangerous activity to help at nests. And one might wonder, as I'm sure Charles Darwin would have wondered, why on earth they would do this. Well, this is me scanning the scrub oak habitat of South Florida. So here's Florida, and here's an image of Florida. And right about there in that area, near Lake Placid in South Florida, is where the Archbold Biological Station is. And this is a place that I did some research for a few years. Actually, for 2 years I was there. Not for the whole period, but I studied Florida scrub jays, and I'm trying to keep track of a female scrub jay in this scrub oak habitat. We were puzzled by this behavior, and we wondered if perhaps the adult birds that were helping to raise the young might actually be males that had snuck copulations, that had actually fertilized eggs in those families, and that they were actually taking care of some of their own offspring. Now, this picture is kind of a joke picture. It shows me trying to get a blood sample from a bird that's perched on my head. These birds are very tame. In reality, we had to catch them and carefully take the blood samples from them. And we took blood samples from them so that we could do parentage analysis, so that we could prove that the so-called mother and father in these families of scrub jays were in fact the only ones that were reproducing. We would also take a small blood sample from the jugular vein of the young scrub jays. This is a very young scrub jay, and I'm drawing blood from its jugular vein. And it's a vein. It's not an artery. When you get all freaked out about vampires going for the jugular and all that, remember, it's a vein. It doesn't spurt blood, and it's a very safe way to take blood samples. No birds were harmed in the course of this study. We take the blood samples. We extract DNA. DNA is the type of molecule that stores our genes, that stores the signals of our genes, that keeps track of the letters and the words that form the proteins that are dictated by our genes. And this is what's known as a DNA fingerprint. And I'm not going to go into depth about this DNA fingerprint other than to say that all of the individuals in several families over a number of years are shown in this DNA fingerprint. And the arrows that you see pointing to bands are pointing to bands that came from the father. And in each of these cases, the father was the presumed male breeder in the family. We always knew he was the father. And the helpers, the male helpers, were not the fathers. We were able to show with these DNA fingerprints that the male helpers were not the fathers, that the presumed fathers, that is the dominant males in each group, were in fact the fathers. So this is a cooperative breeding system. This is called a DNA fingerprint, a multi-locus mini-satellite DNA fingerprint to be precise. And the DNA helps to identify the mother and the father of the nestlings. It also shows who is not the mother or father. And the helpers, importantly, are not the mother or the father. Turns out that it's better to stay home with mom and dad. If it is better to stay home with mom and dad, then you do stay on your home territory. And secondly, as long as you are staying home, it's helpful for you to take care of your brothers and sisters.
You don't say.
This makes sense because this taking care of your brothers and sisters, if it has a hereditary component, if there are genes involved in this, and your brothers and sisters do better, then that characteristic is likely to be shared with them because of heredity, because they're related to you at an R value of 0.5, and therefore we should expect to see such a trait of helping increase in the population. In other words, we should see natural selection leading to the evolution of helper at the nest systems. This is captured in a mathematical inequality called Hamilton's rule. And essentially, although I'm going to tell you what the different parts of the equation are, I'm going to speak in English to tell you what it means. So cooperative behavior should be favored by natural selection when the fitness benefit to the recipient of the behavior multiplied by the coefficient of relatedness, or that R value, how closely related the individuals are, needs to be greater than the cost to the donor, the individual doing the behavior. In other words, if you're closely related enough to an individual And your help is sufficient to help that individual out to the point where, taking into account the relatedness, you will do better than natural selection would favor that particular behavior, that helping behavior. This is referred to as inclusive fitness. It means it includes direct fitness, which is the fitness, the evolutionary fitness, that is how many descendants you would leave over the course of your lifetime through your survival and reproduction, that is reproduction of your own children, your own direct offspring, plus the indirect fitness that you might gain by helping your brothers and sisters if they have babies. You could help them to raise their own kids. And because you share genes in common with those nieces and nephews, that would be part of your inclusive fitness. That's known as indirect fitness. And this Hamilton's inequality is incredibly important whenever one is studying cooperative breeding. And I'm going to talk more about that, but with specifics to the two species that I've introduced already in the next episode. So thank you for being with me. I hope this made sense. And if it didn't, I'm hoping that later we can have a question and answer period and I can clarify some of this. Thanks. Have a great day and stay safe.